Thank you, Ms. Harris and Ms. Harrison for having me today, and thank you to the Southeast Addiction Technology Transfer Centers. I'm really privileged to be able to join with all who are on the call today to talk about trauma-informed practices for the clinical workforce and the peer workforce. So I would love if people could just, I think Dinah Collins did, thank you, put in the chat your name and your role and what a system organization you represent, just trying to get a sense of who's with us today. That would be helpful. I'm guessing many of you are clinicians, and then we always know that there are there's a mix of specialties and job responsibilities, et cetera, in our webinars. So not everyone on this webinar who joined us today would be a clinician who actually provides trauma-specific interventions to clients you're serving. So I'm going to do a little brief overview at the beginning, assuming that we have some variety and diversity in the roles that are represented. So thank you for sharing today. Peer support specialist, thank you so much. RevCore Recovery Center, owner of Small Counseling and Wellness, a clinical supervisor, thank you, Kendra. Coordinator, Department of Community Supervision, very good. Thank you so much. As per usual, it's wonderful to have you, and we do have a mix of professions and roles, which is very, very helpful actually for our conversations. So as Ms. Harris noted, I am Karen Johnson, and I'm really excited to join you today. I am a clinician and worked on the provider side for approximately 19 years in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I'm really from the Midwest, if there's any Midwesterners out there. But I've been living the last 8 years on the East Coast, working in DC, for 5.5 of those years, I worked at the National Council for Behavioral Health and was a trauma-informed, director of trauma-informed services there. And then the last 1.5 years, I went off on my own to do my own independent consulting. But I've been privileged to partner with organizations, systems, and communities who've been striving to advance the trauma-informed approach across their organizations, across their culture, the cultures of their communities and their systems and their organizations. And I've also, through that journey, worked with organizations on the specific clinical work. And that's where we're going to focus more today. But I want to take a minute. We've been doing more of this since COVID, and we're, starting to get more practice at remembering that we have to, more often than we ever did before, to center ourselves, to ground ourselves, to practice mindfulness. So in the spirit of that, I'd like you just to take a moment to get comfortable in your chair, feet on the ground, perhaps sitting up straight, however you're comfortable, and then take a few deep breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth, in through your nose, out through your mouth. And now I'd like you to gaze into this picture. One way we can practice mindfulness is to become color aware. So I'd like you to let all the colors in this picture become conscious to you. The tones, the shades, the hues of a color that most of us call green. What are the objects, the sizes that you see of trees, the textures of the leaves? Ground yourself in the countless differences in this image. And now I'd ask you to turn to being aware of your own emotions. So, we're already at Thursday, so it's been a long week already, and I'm guessing perhaps you've had a range of emotions during your work week through since Monday. Maybe there's been some emotion, some feelings of fulfillment, of making a difference. Perhaps there's been some negative emotions of feeling overwhelmed, exhausted. I'd like you to think about how you're feeling right now. Is it negative? Is it positive? Or perhaps are you feeling just numb? And if you're numb, that's okay. That's where you are right now. And now take a minute to forgive yourself for any negative emotions that you may have that are present for you, and practice some self-compassion, and remember always that you are doing the best you can. And now to turn our thoughts to others in your life. Perhaps think of someone who might need some more support today, who may be struggling with an event in their life, with something that's going on for them. Can you send them out some positive thoughts, some supportive thoughts? And then finally, think about, if you'd like, our community. Are there parts of your community that are struggling? And what can you hold up and support in your thoughts and your feelings today related to community, related to the people that you interface with most, but also related to what's going on in our country? So now we're just going to finish with two more breaths, deep breaths. And out. And I'll say one more time, please remember that you are doing the best you can, and it is absolutely enough. So thank you for that. Again, in our work, I think for all of us, we've learned the need to regulate ourselves, to be more present, to practice mindfulness when we can. So always doing this at the beginning of a meeting, beginning of a session, of course, with someone that you're partnering with. Really the beginning of many different events can be very helpful, and remind us that we need to take a breath. So today we're going to talk about, this is our overview for today. I want to just do some brief definitions, spend a little time talking about evidence-based practice, or is it evidence-based practitioner? I have some thoughts on that. Talk about practitioner core competencies, trauma-informed treatment objectives and strategies, the general stages of trauma treatment. Make sure we always talk about and focus on resilience. Spend a little time talking about the very important components of the clinical treatment pathway, being screening and assessment, and then end with talking about some common trauma-informed specific treatments that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with or have heard of, and just share some overall lists and take a deeper dive into approximately 3 or 4 of those. So get to the next slide. So as I said, want to start with some definitions. Adversity, toxic stress, and trauma. We often interchange these concepts. And so I think it's helpful to just take a moment here at the beginning to break them out and remind us all about, what they are meant to represent, the terms. So child adversity is a wide range of circumstances or events that pose a serious threat to a child's physical or psychological well-being. There's many different, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. There's many different, I'm just trying to move over my pictures here so I can see the full screen. Many different types of child adversity that can be experienced, and including, of course, we're going to talk about child abuse and neglect, domestic violence, bullying, serious accidents, injuries, etc. We know from research that is continuing to grow that these experiences can have serious consequences, especially when they occur early in life, are chronic or severe, and are layered over time. Adverse child experiences is a term coined by the researchers Vince Folletti and Robert Anda, related to the seminal research study that was conducted in the late 90s, the Adverse Child Experiences Study. So when we talk about adverse child experiences, it can be a broad term, but it's most often meant to represent a subset of childhood adversities that were included in that ACEs study. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Adverse Child Experiences Study. If for some reason you aren't, I would definitely point you to that that huge body of information. You can certainly find that on the CDC website, and it has very much helped us understand the impact and prevalence of adversity throughout the years 1 to 18 or 0 to 18, and then how it impacts us across the lifespan. Trauma is one possible outcome of exposure to adversity. It occurs when a person perceives an event or a set of circumstances as extremely frightening, harmful, life-threatening, either emotionally, physically, or both. With trauma, a child experiencing those strong negative emotions, terror or helplessness, and physiological symptoms such as a rapid heartbeat, bedwetting, stomach aches, may develop soon after event or set of circumstances takes place, or can continue well beyond their initial exposure and well into adulthood. So we know that trauma experienced, especially in childhood, is associated with problems across multiple domains of development. But we also know that it affects us individually. So how an individual is impacted, or the impacts that they experience, often is connected to her own individual or their own individual set of resilience factors, protective factors, family, environment, other risk and protective factors. And then toxic stress occurs when a child or an adult experiences adversity that is extreme, long-lasting, and severe. Without adequate support from a caring adult, that can serve as a buffer. It usually wears down the body and brain over time, and it can cause the stress response system to become overactivated. Toxic stress has been a significant concern during the pandemic, for really in a very universal way. We know that the pandemic and also the events related to our reckoning with racial and social equity, et cetera, have impacted disproportionately communities of color. We know that, and individuals who live in communities that might experience poverty, violence, et cetera. There's been a disproportionate impact on those communities. And we also know that toxic stress in general has in some way been experienced in a rather universal level across the whole country, across the whole globe. So it's very important to pay attention to it. So this slide just really outlines some common forms of trauma or sets of circumstances that are experienced. So homelessness, child abuse and neglect, long-term chronic illness, child experiencing domestic or community or school violence, natural disasters, being exposed to being in a war-torn zone, or even perhaps waiting to be sent to a military zone, et cetera. We know that military families are profoundly impacted. Political trauma. This slide is really personal grief and loss. And that happens in many different ways. It happens through divorce, it happens through incarceration, it happens through foster care, it happens through death of a loved one, death of a friend or family member. And so to understand that people are profoundly impacted by the traumatic loss of, or the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a family, the loss of a community, the loss of a culture, is very important for us to understand. Accident or illness. And this last picture depicts what we call historical cumulative trauma, which is trauma or catastrophic events that are experienced by a group of people and are not healed across multiple generations. So the impact of those events impact children and ancestors that were never present for the original trauma. This picture is of children in a boarding school in Alaska during the time when we felt that we needed to assimilate people to the American culture. So these children were taken from their homes. They were required to cut their hair. They could not speak their native language. They could not practice their cultural rituals. They could not see their families of origin. And of course, these events impacted them as individuals, and then impacted them across the lifespan, impacted their ability to connect in relationships, their ability to parent, even when they were able to overcome significant odds and create positive protective factors for their children, it still impacted their ancestors. So just want to talk, so that was the trauma definition on that page, and then we have continuum of stress. And just want to note here that the purpose of this slide is just to note that all stress is not negative. In fact, we need stress to grow, to develop. Stress helps us be resilient. So positive stress over on the left side, that mild, moderate, and short-lived stress, is very healthy for development. It's very healthy for children. It's healthy for us as adults. Tolerable stress is when the stress becomes more severe, but it's limited in duration and we can still recover. We still have people who can support us and allow us to have respite, etc. It's this toxic stress on the right side of the chart, when it's extreme, frequent, or extended activation of the body stress response without the buffering presence of a supportive adult or relationship, which bathes us in stress hormones, which changes our neurobiology, which causes us to be over our neural response system, our stress responses to become oversensitized. So this picture is an image that Dr. Bruce Perry from the Child Trauma Academy uses. It's really a very oversimplified depiction of the human brain. The interesting thing about this is his work. If you're familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry, amazing, I think, influencer, a psychiatrist and neuroscientist who helps us understand how our brains are impacted by trauma. His work is coming more and more into the mainstream. So I'm going to share about that in just a minute. But what this upside down pyramid shows is that, or is meant to depict, is first that the brain comes online from the bottom up. It develops from the bottom up. Brainstem first at birth. Our cortex comes fully online when we're approximately age 25 or older. The brain mediates our thoughts, feelings, actions, and connections to others in the world. So we really, as clinicians, of course, I'm guessing all of you understand this. For those who aren't necessarily in the clinical world, to understand that when we can talk about our lower brain, our brainstem, and the different functions of these very basic pieces of the brain that can be very helpful to us. The brainstem controls temperature, heart rate, and blood pressure, midbrain sleep, appetite, motor regulation, the limbic system in a very general sense, emotional reactivity, and the cortex is, where our abstract and concrete thought lives, our executive functioning. It is when we can do long-term planning, when we can collaborate, think abstractly. Okay, so our stress response system and the billions of networks that are involved in it are housed in our lower brain. And all of the stimuli that we experience every day, every minute, every second, everything that you're seeing, feeling, hearing right now from the external world, plus our internal world, maybe your bladder's starting to fill up, maybe you didn't get to eat lunch and you're hungry, those stimuli are all coming through our lower brain, and it's those set of core networks that are deciding whether we are safe or not. And if we're not, if there's something that's picked up that says, we need water, we go and get water, or we need to use the bathroom, or we need to eat. We take care of those things usually. Sometimes there are stimuli that come in that cause us to become more alert, fearful, to become in a state of terror. And that, when that happens, when we respond through fight, flight, or freeze, because we have had a stimuli come in that has told us that we are not safe, our frontal cortex goes online. We're no longer calm. We're no longer really alert. We're in a state of terror in which we cannot think into the future. We really can't think more than 2 or 3 seconds ahead. We are, may become aggressive. We may dissociate and just really check out completely. Basically, it's very difficult when we're in the survival mode, what we often call survival mode, our survival brain, to learn, process, and grow those things that are so important for all of our work and for our healing from traumatic experiences. I wanted to show you that this is, maybe you've seen it, Dr. Bruce Perry's and Oprah Winfrey's newest book. It came out within the last 3 weeks. What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. And his model and that last picture I showed you and many other pictures are all in this book. So if you haven't been exposed to him, it's really wonderful and very much, very consumable. I would point you to this book. So what we try to do with folks and with ourselves is teach regulation, how to quiet our lower brain so we can stay in our frontal cortex when we're becoming anxious or frustrated or fearful or really in a state of terror because of some influence, some stimuli that's happened. And for folks who have an oversensitized stress response system, those stimuli are going to come to us even, or trigger responses we call them, or trauma responses we call them, are going to influence our lower brain even when there is no imminent threat in place. There's no danger. There's nothing in the environment that would hurt us. What we need to do is we need to learn how to regulate. And I just want to share this briefly, and then we'll move on into trauma-specific interventions, the piece about the trauma-informed practitioner, et cetera. So there's 3 ways that we regulate, that we calm our lower brain. We can use the top-down, use our cortex, do things like gratitude practices, mantras, speaking mantras, etc. This piece here, mind the gap, understanding that there's a pause between a stimuli and our actions. The challenge with the top-down regulation is we need our frontal cortex to be online to do that. So when it's not online because we've had some kind of stimuli come through our lower brain and our cortex is offline, we're going to have real trouble using those types of regulation strategies. Another regulation strategy is bottom up, so from the lower brain up. So somatosensory that connect our body and our brain, rhythmic repetitive interventions, music, dance, walking, breathing. These are some of the very helpful bottom up somatosensory interventions we can use to quiet our lower brain. And again, when we're bathed in toxic stress, we need to do it more often. And then with other people, you'll hear throughout this whole time together, it's about connections. It's about healing within the context of relationships. And the good news is it doesn't have to be a big dose. It doesn't have to be a 45-minute session. It can be, we can teach, the people we serve, we can teach ourselves to reach out to others in a short text that says, supervisors can do this with supervisees, right? I hope you're well, thinking of you today. How can I help? What do you need? So this being with other people, we're hardwired for connection. Emotions are contagious, and hanging out or connecting to a calm, nurturing adult or other person can help us come back into our upper brain, out of our lower brain, can calm us down. This I love, Regulate, Relate, Reason. It's also in the new book. And he calls this, Dr. Perry calls this a sequence of engagement, helping us to remember that since everything goes through our lower brain, for us to understand something that's coming to our frontal cortex, we need to be regulated first. So I love what he says. He says, someone else's frontal cortex, even though they're sitting in the chair right across from us, their frontal cortex is pretty far away from us, because everything we say has to go through their lower brain and up through the survival stress response system to get to the place where we can reason with each other. And the same for the information we're receiving. So this sequence of engagement to regulate first, to ensure that our interactions always, before our interactions are together, we're regulating together. We're doing some kind of breathing, those regulation strategies I just talked about, etc. So, and then relating to an individual as a human being, you know, what's going on with you today? How have you been sleeping? Tell me what your thoughts have been. You know, it can be, how are you? That sometimes is problematic for folks, but what are you feeling today? That, to relate to an individual as a human being, of course, and then get to the reasoning part, all the complex conversations we want to have, both in a clinical interaction, in a clinical therapy session, or in a peer session, or even in our work lives. I think this regulate, relate, reason could be a poster in many of our organizations, because specifically as it relates to work, we go so fast to the to-dos that we forget that that stuff isn't going to land in someone else's frontal cortex unless we're both regulated and we both related. Okay, so moving on to, very briefly, a trauma-informed approach. Trauma-informed approach is an organizational intervention that we use to across a total organization to create safe environments in which we're using all this knowledge about how we heal, how we regulate, what people need, to create the best environments for healing, and so staff can do the work. I shared these principles because they are obviously just as relevant for trauma-specific interventions at the clinical level. So safety is incredibly important. People aren't going to heal from their recovery, or heal from their traumatic histories, or move forward on their recovery journey if they don't feel safe. And staff are going to really struggle to do the work in a trauma-informed way if they don't feel safe. Trust and transparency, for sure. Building trust, I'm going to talk more about both, but if there isn't trust and transparency inherent in a relationship, there's going to be limited progress made. Collaboration and mutuality, to the extent that we can make sure that the person who we're serving in the treatment setting is driving the boat, is the person in charge, and we're all supporting that person to the best of our ability in a collaborative way. And then mutuality, leveling the power differentials. A clinician is always going to have more power inherently over someone that they're serving, and same with the case manager, etc. And in an organization, there's always hierarchy. But how can we relate as human beings? How can we level the power differentials and connect on a human level? Empowerment, voice, and choice. Of course, I know that you do this with the people that you serve, always helping them find their strengths and their goals, identifying those and sorting out, how they can realize them. Voice and choice, making sure people always understand what's available to them and they can feel safe enough to speak to what they need. Respect for cultural, historical, and gender differences. Here we know that we really aren't going to be trauma-informed either at the organizational level or in the clinical level unless we are understanding an individual's culture, how they've been impacted by historical events in their lives, historical trauma, and understand gender sensitivity, and being very clear on joining with an individual around these topics. And then peer support and mutual self-help. And we're going to talk more about peer support, but those of you who are in the peer world, the peer support specialists, there's nothing more trauma-informed in many ways than that peer support relationship in which people don't feel so alone and they're able to connect with someone that has had the same experiences and can offer such incredible and relevant support and guidance. So the tenets of this work are, moving from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that paradigm shift. So we move from a deficit-focused approach to a strength-based approach, understanding that everybody has been impacted by the events in their lives. We learned this through the ACEs study that I mentioned and all the research that has come since that time. The neurobiology research and evidence is teaching us this. And this piece is so helpful. I'm guessing many of you have experienced it, but for me, when I was able to share with someone, a birth parent, I worked a lot in foster care in my 20 years on the provider side, and did, clinical interventions with both foster parents and birth parents. The aha moments that were experienced when a birth parent was able to understand that they're not broken, understand in a cognitive sense. That doesn't mean it's a lot of healing to get that into the body and the bones, but to understand in a cognitive sense that they're not broken. They aren't weak. They aren't unlovable. It's that they've been impacted by the events in their lives, and they've survived to this point, and they've been resilient, and their symptoms have been adaptations to help them survive until now. And that is tremendous strength. And when people understand that and see that, the light goes on. I'll like, you're kidding me, right? And then, of course, the work is to help people understand, no, we're not kidding. This is the truth. So that's the paradigm shift. And assuming everyone is doing the best they can. I mean, that is so helpful at every level. I would say, especially at the organizational level, clinical too as well, of course. But when we can bring that to our peers, to our colleagues, to our supervisors, and our leaders can bring that to us. And when we bring it to the people we serve, if someone is missing appointments on a regular basis or not engaging in the ways that we need them to, or treatment isn't moving along in the ways that you hoped, we assume, regardless of the challenges, that everyone is still doing the best they can. So it's really about what lens are you looking through. It's easier said than done to change the lens to this. It's not what's wrong with you, what's happened to you, but this is the work that we embrace. So trauma-specific services, these trauma-specific clinical services are offered in a trauma-informed environment. I would suggest that if you're a clinician doing trauma-specific services in an organization or a clinic or a system that isn't trauma-informed, you're going to have less impact. If someone leaves your office and goes to the front desk and experiences a difficult interaction with a receptionist or a billing person about a bill that's unpaid, that isn't trauma-informed, that is going to take you could be the best therapist and peer support specialist there ever was. The impact of your work is going to be minimized or lessened. This work focuses on treating trauma through therapeutic interventions involving practitioners with specialist skills. That is very true. There are generalized things that really anyone in a workforce can do to promote resilience. And the trauma-informed work is about everyone in the workforce. Absolutely. That is very important. And then when we're talking about the trauma journey on understanding how someone understanding what their trauma history is, how they've been impacted, unpacking that happens in partnership with a skilled clinician. We use detailed assessments of clients around trauma, mental health, and substance use concerns, and those help us. We use that information in partnership with the people we're serving to provide integrated treatment. So I want to, this question about evidence-based practice is not the same as a best practice. We spent a lot of time in our work, in our organizations, in our field, creating evidence-based practices. That's not a bad thing, but there are downsides to it. And is it always best practice? And especially, what does that mean for the practitioner? So I want to show this. This is a video from Dr. Tony Salerno. He's a colleague of mine from the National Council. I'm only going to share about the first 4 minutes of this talk that he did at the National Council Conference, but he talks about the evidence-based practices versus the evidence-based practitioner or the best practitioner. So let me see if I can make it come up first, and then we'll go from there. Okay.
Okay. So the reason why I'm saying this is the idea of the consumer perspective.
Okay, I just need to go back to the beginning. Here we go. And again, there's a little introduction here, but I hope if you can't hear it, let me know. But he gets at it pretty quickly. So thank you.
My name is Tony Salerno. My usual role, and I work with the National Council, is to introduce the TED Talkers. And I had mentioned Joe Parks would not be able to make it as the first speaker. So you got me instead, okay? And so I'll do my best to kind of resurrect a topic that I had discussed earlier. And this is, let me first give you a little bit of my background. I retired from the Office of Mental Health in New York State, and I'm just involved in like running a lot of outpatient programs and worked inpatient for a long time. I was a high school teacher before I became a psychologist. And the last number of years with the Office of Mental Health, I was the director of evidence-based practice initiatives. And my job was to go around the state of New York and raise the awareness of provider communities about what do we mean by evidence-based practices and why is it so important? And then really the critical question is how in God's name do you ever help organizations to begin to adopt and implement evidence-based practices? But through that whole process, I kind of came to a few insights, right? Well, I think they're insights and some ideas that I think is worth sharing because I thoroughly embrace the importance of taking research and the evidence and having that guide our decisions around treatments and services. And the clients that we serve deserve that. But this whole issue of make sure you stay faithful to the evidence-based practice seemed to be a very critical principle. And I want to challenge it just a little bit, to stretch our brains around this. Because for many organizations, trying to keep faithful, right, was quite a challenge. And does that mean you just sort of like dump the whole thing because you can't implement at a very high level of fidelity? So that's the topic, right? Is it really a sin to be unfaithful? And as a recovering Catholic, that's an important issue for me as well. Okay, so here's the problem, right? You have the evidence-based practices. They're usually done in like a kind of a lab-controlled setting. And then you got the provider kind of realities, which isn't so well controlled, right? And it says, well, how can we make these things come together and address this gap? And so the really big challenge is how to make this all happen. So what I'm going to say is that evidence-based practice in of itself, what the research tells us, it really isn't the whole picture at all. It's not the same as the best practice. And I think what the Institute of Medicine, one of their definitions around best practices and quality practice is more than just what the evidence is. As it turns out, you know what seems to be pretty important? Like the practitioner's experience and their knowledge and skills. What do you think? It's kind of like important, right? To be able to engage clients, right? To be able to deal with many challenges that come up. So those interpersonal, engaging, motivation sorts of skills are not inconsequential. They're core to the work. But then there's even something even more important. Apparently, the client's perspective seems to be important too, right? Of whether what you're providing really aligns with what is a felt need. So when we really think about it, the notion of a real quality practice needs to take into account the evidence, but also the practitioner's core competencies, and particularly around engagement and relationship building, as well as the consumer's perspective. And when they line up, you got a best practice. Make sense? Okay. So the reason why I'm saying this is the idea of the consumer perspective. All of the research, the billions of dollars that have gone into medications, all the training that folks have had, psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, all the money goes into the buildings that we create, right, to provide services. They pretty much come down to very little if the client gives you one of these. Anybody from New York? All right, so from New York, you know what that's all about. But really, when you think about it, all it takes is a client going like this, and all those billions of dollars of medication and research and all the training you have has been reduced to kind of hardly anything. So I think that that's an important consideration in how we look at quality practices.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to continue. This is the picture that he was showing over on the screen that we couldn't see. But a really good practice, in including a really good trauma-informed trauma-specific clinical practice involves these three things. Yes, it involves research and evidence. All the research has gone into what works, in EMDR, DBT, TFCBT, seeking safety, etc. And then we need the practitioner experience and expertise. And what does that involve? We're going to talk about that. I think what Dr. Salerno was speaking to is this relational engagement has to be present. And then, of course, the consumer perspective. What is the patient or the client, the participant saying about how they're experiencing the services they're receiving? I wanted to, in this talk that Dr. Salerno does near the end of the video, he shares a story about that specific thing, trying to sort out what works best for the person being served. And he tells the story of a colleague who had worked with one patient for close to 2 years. And this gentleman had made good progress and definitely moved forward in their healing journey, in their treatment planning, etc. And this colleague of Dr. Salerno's wanted to sort out, what was it that was most helpful? And they had used many different strategies with this gentleman. And so he asked him, he said, so tell me, let's say his name is Bob, tell me, Bob, out of all the things that we've done together over these last 2 years, and we've done this and we've done this and we've done this, what do you think was most helpful? Because it would be really helpful for me to know. And Bob said to him, oh, I really loved it when you shake my hand at the beginning of every session, when you met me in the lobby and shake my hand. Yeah. And so, Tony, Dr. Salerno's colleague was, well, thank you so much for sharing. It doesn't mean the other pieces of the puzzle weren't important, but if the relationship piece isn't there where someone feels seen and valued as a human being, the rest, the evidence isn't, the research and evidence-based practices are going to have much less of an impact. So humbling story. So when we're selecting an evidence-based practice to use, to become trained on or use in our organizations and our clinics, these are some thoughts to consider, especially when we're looking at being trauma-informed. Is the model or the practice relational? How does it embrace the relationship component, the engagement of the person that we're partnering with? Is it founded on accurate information about how bodies react under stress? So is it founded on brain science and helps us, helps to have different modalities of intervention for when someone is in their lower brain? So a purely cognitive intervention sometimes can fall short if we don't have other mechanisms within the context of that intervention to help people get to their frontal cortex so they can hear the information. So how is the model embracing the brain science? Does it focus on resilience? We forget about resilience, and we can't forget about it, because whenever we're talking about trauma, we need to talk about resilience. They're the same side. They're two different sides of the same coin. And though, it's not what's wrong with you, what's happened to you is all about strength-based and resilience. So does it support acquisition of resilient skills? And does the model recognize that cognition is not the only way people heal and stabilize? So it's not always a talk therapy, a cognitive-based approach, but there are many, many other ways that people can heal. So either you're prescribing those after a session, or that's part of homework, or you're integrating somatosensory mind-body connection type of interactions into your practice, or they're available throughout your organization. Yoga, gardening, whatever exercise, whatever it might be, that's part of the whole approach. So these are some of the, practitioner core competencies. I would say these are what Dr. Salerno was referencing in his talk. If you're missing this, it doesn't matter what evidence-based practice you're using. So of course, to be relationally aligned, sorting out how you can connect with the individual that you're serving and partnering with. Are you transparent in your interactions? Are you making sure you're not hiding things? I think, you know, collaborative documentation, when the notes are shared between the participant and the clinician and signed off on before the session ends, is one incredible example of transparency. So anything you're saying in your notes, you would say to the person you're serving. Shared decision making. Does the person you're serving understand what's available to them, and are they weighing in? Of course, person-centered focus, and then psychoeducation. We're going to talk about that. When we're talking about the person being served, we just have to focus on these various components. Understanding their perspectives to the best of our ability, or always being curious. I mean, it's very hard for us to understand someone's individual perspectives because we only see things as we are, but to always be open and curious to learn more about an individual's values, needs, wants, expectations, cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, comfort with the practice, comfort with the practitioner. These I'm sure you're very familiar with, so I won't spend much time here, but we know that there are certainly actions that disengage individuals that will cause an individual to really shut down in a session, to perhaps not come back, or maybe they come back, but it's very limited engagement. You know, doing any hard sell or persuasion, arguing always for change. Of course, any shaming or blaming or criticizing is going to put someone in their lower brain, and they're going to become less available to you. Of course, scare tactics, not necessarily helpful. You got to be careful about incentives, how those play out for people. Ultimatums, using guilt, and then feeling rushed or distracted, making sure, of course, that we're very present in any session. Assuming the expert role, I would argue that in our clinical interventions, especially when we're doing trauma-specific interventions, we are not the expert. We may be the expert around, you know, the clinical practice and how people heal and making recommendations, but we are not the expert on the individual that we're serving. They are the expert. And so, you know, it's very much a partnership. Labeling or pejorative language, giving advice without being asked to give advice. Rushing a conversation. I mean, this part about seeing only the con side of behavior can be pretty hard for individuals as well. We know that individuals who have experienced trauma have survived, and they've used adaptive behaviors to get through really difficult times, and are still using them, perhaps because their stress response system is still oversensitized. They're having very intense emotions and experiences that they need to self-medicate for, or use coping skills that that perhaps are maladaptive for them. But we know that individuals cling to these behaviors or survival modes to ease the physical or psychological trauma they've experienced. And we have to just be careful not to judge and label or dismiss these symptoms without understanding how they can be valuable to the person we're serving. So anger, you know, is an incredibly adaptive behavior that can have high survival value, especially in certain situations. And it, you know, expressing anger can be an attempt to ward off subsequent harm, hide vulnerabilities, or keep people from getting close to you. People that, you know, might hurt you, or anyone, because no one has ever really been helpful to you. You haven't felt safe with other individuals. And too often we try to change that behavior without knowing how it helps individuals. So having a client be able to discover how those symptoms have been helpful to them can be validating and empowering, and it can lay the foundation for then finding healthier ways to achieve that same level of protection. And of course, focusing on what's wrong with you is less than helpful as well. So these next strategies for what we do when we're a trauma-informed clinician are in SAMHSA's clinician's guide that is a addendum to their tip 57. It's at the end of the slide deck. And it's a really nice short resource that talks all about trauma-informed clinical practices. So I wanted to talk through some of these strategies that they offer for the trauma-informed clinician or peer worker, peer support specialist. Obviously, safety. You know, as I've already noted, trauma is not going to be resolved in any way, or healing is not going to happen unless an individual feels safe. So promoting shared decision making, teaching grounding techniques, teaching those back to regulation, teaching ways people can regulate so they can quiet down their body and use their frontal cortex more often to keep themselves safe. Clearly establishing specific routines in therapy, so a structured setting can provide a sense of safety and familiarity with individuals who have histories of trauma. We can explore safe and unsafe behaviors, so have individuals identify on paper behaviors that promote safety and behaviors that feel unsafe for them today. This one here, give permission for the client to not trust you. I found that to be very helpful in my work, specifically with birth parents in foster care, also foster parents. I mean, there is no reason that an individual should trust you at the beginning of working together, and it likely could take many months before they really believe that you are working in their best interests, that they can effectively partner with you. And when you take the power out of that and give permission for a client to not trust you, that you have to earn that trust, I think that goes a long way to establishing safety. Clearly, we want to prevent re-traumatization. This is why we create trauma-informed environments. So both in the clinical office and out at the reception and in the parking lot. And when we're billing, dealing with billing and financing, et cetera, we're not re-traumatizing clients. So we want to be sensitive to the needs of clients, consider behaviors in the treatment setting that might activate memories of trauma, acknowledge trauma histories and trauma responses when we don't pay attention to them or we ignore those symptoms. It can often be a way for people to disengage or leads to disengagement. Listen for respect and teach about activations in things in the environment that are causing someone to have a trauma response. When we do that, we give people power. It's so empowering for individuals to understand how, what has caused a trauma response, what's caused them to have, risen heartbeat, panic attack type symptoms, and then to learn what they can do about it. And of course, be mindful that efforts can produce a trauma response. People who have interfaced with our systems, whether they be mental health systems or criminal justice or any type of system, have, and even in relationships, who have experienced trauma have often experienced a lot of control over them and have adverse reactions to that. Providing psychoeducation. Understand the client's expectations and make sure you understand what they are and you can level set around expectations. Of course, I know you do this. I'm sharing information about the program and the treatment. Provide overview of common symptoms of trauma. I think that can be, again, very empowering in a way to normalize that what's happening is very common. It's a biological function. It's physiological. It's how our bodies and brains work. That can be very empowered. And then, of course, provide a lot of resources, whatever resources you may be able to provide, that grounding techniques, regulation strategies, other ways, support systems in the community, other ways that they can an individual connect with the advantages of peer support, connecting with peer support, et cetera. Here we go with offering trauma-informed peer support. The experience of trauma can reinforce beliefs about being different, alone, and marred by the experience. So trauma-informed peer support can break the cycle of beliefs that reinforce that traumatic stress, provides opportunities to form mutual relationships, defines recovery as an interactive process, a back and forth between people, both in the clinical setting, and then that can be taught and transferred into an individual's community and their family setting, and counters beliefs about being alone, different, and broken. Normalize, identify, and manage symptoms. Again, psychoeducation that addresses a client's specific symptoms. So being able to get specific about what's happening to them. Explore, the consequences of these symptoms. when we can help separate the current situation from the past trauma, that can be very, very helpful. This is done specifically, all of this really, but this for sure, when we're starting to talk about specifically about past trauma, we do need to do that in the context of a safe environment with a trained clinician who can create safety for the individual who may become activated, et cetera. But, you know, cognitive realignment to help separate the current situation from the past. So, you know, you can work through one activation or one trigger at a time, and then discuss questions such as, when and where did you begin to notice a reaction to this? How does this situation remind you of your past history or past trauma? How are your reactions to the current situation similar to your past reactions to trauma? How was this current situation different from the past trauma? So really helping people create that difference, that separation from what's going on today and the person they are today, very different from the original events and who the person was at that time. And of course, establish responses and coping strategies. Back to coping strategies, helping people sort out how to focus on their breathing, name the situation that initiated a trauma response, focus on emotions, recognize that the situation doesn't define you or your future, validate the experience, ask for help, etc. Address sleep disturbances and disorders. A lot of this going on. It's always been a challenge with the pandemic. It's become more universal in nature. So all of this is relevant to all of us, really, but I would remind us that this is for our own individual self as well. You know, sleep disturbances are prevalent and enduring with individuals who've experienced trauma. So how can we provide education on sleep hygiene, perhaps conduct a sleep history? There are assessments out there that can help to assess the habits, and when we assess the habits, then people can sort out how to respond and what to do about it. Again, this we don't want to overlook. Sleep is critical to health and well-being, and to healing, and to being resilient. So addressing this early and often is an important consideration. You know, teaching balance. This is about, you know, walking a thin line between, as a clinician, between too much work focused on highly distressing content that can cause a client to dissociate, to shut down, or become emotionally overwhelmed, or too little on the content that may reinforce avoidance and confirm the client's internal belief that it's too dangerous to deal with the aftermath of trauma. So we have to worry about re-traumatization and walk that fine balance with the people that we're serving in our clinical settings. There are scales that we can use. One is called the Subject Units of Distress Scale, SUDS, which we can use to objectively try to measure, you know, where someone is related to the challenges they may be experiencing within the context of a session. We want to pay attention to the pace of the work, and then always teach grounding techniques. Those those techniques can help us come back into our body, help us regulate, again, come out of our lower brain. So this is an important piece of our being a clinician and a peer support specialist in our trauma-informed specific interventions. And this piece goes to the importance of really making sure that we have the specialty we need, the experience we need to be able to safely take people through their trauma, talk about their trauma activations, their triggers, and then through their trauma healing journey. Building resilience. We want to always be doing this, and this we can all do. Develop community connections and strengthen social support, wellness and crisis plans, healthy lifestyle and wellness, you know, those buffering protective factors that we're all talking about so much, that have always been so important, and sometimes we just kind of ignore them. But eating well, sleeping again, exercise, connecting with people in our lives that can be helpful to us. Developing coping and self-regulation skills, back to regulation, focusing on strengths, finding meaning through any creative expression. And then using culturally and gender responsive services. I talked a little bit about this when I was talking about the principles of trauma-informed approach. We just have to be always curious about this, understanding what the role of historical trauma is in an individual's life. Historical trauma is a little bit of a misname because it also is cumulative trauma. We know that racism and microaggressions and discrimination is happening every single day. And there's a really good chance that if you're serving an individual of color or an LGBTQI person who identifies on that spectrum, et cetera, or if you're serving a person who identifies of any minority group, there's a good chance that they've experienced some kind of microaggression within the past week or even today, the day you saw them. So to be able to understand that, to validate that, to join with that is very important. We can sometimes use cultural brokers who can help us interpret cultural patterns and help be a liaison to the people that we're serving that may not be part of our culture, our overall group culture. And of course, look at the individual socioculture support network and how that views trauma. I think overall we talk about cultural humility, always being in a learning stance. Clearly, this needs to be addressed if we don't identify in the same way with the people we're serving. If we're a white clinician serving a person of color, we need to address that. We need to talk about it. We need to be curious, sort out what an individual needs and how we can best understand and best support the individual that we're serving, as one example. So I want to talk briefly about the stages of trauma treatment and recovery. This work, tons of people have weighed in on this, but the specific steps is from Judith Herman. Her book, Trauma and Recovery, is kind of a seminal book. I would encourage everyone to read that. She talks about 3 stages, and others have come up with different stages, 4 or 5, but most of them, I think all of them really include these three areas: safety, mourning, remembrance, and reconnection. So safety is when we shift from unpredictable danger to reliable safety, focusing on grounding techniques, on helping people understand what activates them in their environment, people being able to understand how they can get out of their lower brain and be in their frontal cortex, what they need to stay safe. And for individuals who have never experienced safety, that's not necessarily easy. It's not something that comes naturally. So, what does an individual need to feel safe? And it's important to note that some individuals who are on a healing journey really only need to do this step. It is not necessary for everyone to go to the next step, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But sometimes people who can craft safety in their lives, that is enough for them that is enough for them related to having a fulfilling life, and it can be enough for what they need. Obviously, grounding techniques can help with safety. You know what grounding techniques are, I'm quite sure. Again, being present in your body, help manage dissociation, overwhelming trauma-related emotions, focusing on the present, deep breathing, relaxation, guided imagery, hypnosis. The second step is mourning and remembrance, and this is where, in the care of a skilled clinician, the survivor tells their story. The therapist plays the role of witness and ally, and over time, they reconstruct and transform the traumatic memory. As I said, not everyone needs to go through this step, but safety can sometimes be enough. If you're doing this, then clearly you're very specifically trained to find the balance for the client to keep them safe in the process of mourning and remembrance. And then reconnection, the third phase in trauma treatment recovery, where the person who has survived trauma creates a new future and reclaims their world. I know myself, I have myself, I am a thriver, all of those things. They restate the story, the trauma history, with a different lens in which they have survived and they have thrived and they are strong and they are resilient. So resilience, again, is part of building, very important in our trauma-specific interventions. So what practitioners need to know or remember is resilience is not static, it's dynamic, and people can learn it. It's not something that you're just born with and you have it or you don't. Of course, people can learn it, and we can all strengthen a person's resilience. Environmental factors may be an important piece related to resilience, maybe even more important than individual factors. So this is where we as practitioners, in the context of our organizational work, need to be aware of the environment in which people are living, the core causes of trauma responses, and understand that the work has to go beyond our individual clinical office. Whether we're doing that specifically or the organization is helping with that, the organization is connected to the community to address the root causes of trauma in the community. There has to be some connection if we're really going to focus on resilience. So we're connected to the schools, we're connected to criminal justice, we're connected to the housing folks, we're connected to the ACEs, the ACEs connection initiatives in our community. We're connected to all of the organizations that are working on compassion, resilience, and well-being. And maybe individually we can't be, but as an organization or as a network of care, we are making sure that we play a role in influencing those conversations, that we are playing a role in improving and addressing root causes of trauma. So we can connect people to other sources of support, promote positive parent-child relationships. You know, parents are stressed and overwhelmed, as we know. Many parents have their own trauma histories and live in a world of judgment in which people have not understood that it's also not what's wrong with them, but it's what's happened to them. So joining with parents in that same way is part of this process. Promoting, of course, positive youth development, coordinating care across multiple agencies, but not just agencies, community care organizations, peer support organizations. There are every community has peer-run organizations. How are we connecting with them? How are they teaching us? How are we teaching them? What are the relationships? What are the partnerships? And of course, understand that trauma is not just a cognitive experience. This is the American Psychological Association's list of things that we want to look at when we're building resilience. Make connections. Loneliness is a huge piece, a huge challenge, even more so since the pandemic, but it's been an epidemic in our world for a long time. So how do we help individuals make connections? Avoid seeing crisis as insurmountable problems. Accept that change is a part of our life. Change is always going to happen. You know, people who are experiencing resilience or building resilience are making actions towards their goals. They're getting better and flexing their muscles about making decisive actions, as small as those decisions may be. Looking for opportunities for self-discovery. Nurturing a positive view of ourselves, keeping things in perspective, remaining hopeful, and taking care of ourselves. So I'm going to keep moving here in the interest of time, but that was Vivek Murphy. I can just tell you that he really helps ourselves understand loneliness, and that it's an epidemic. And when we are experiencing loneliness, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. Back to fight, flight, or freeze, back to our neurobiology. And we go into survival mode. And so how do we build connection? What he says is individuals who experience loneliness, and there's ways to measure it, as you know, are at greater risk of early death than people who smoke 14 cigarettes a day. So it is definitely worth our time to focus on connection. whether someone can have one relationship, one person who checks in on them, however we can forge connection. And we know individuals who experience trauma, one of the challenges they have is trusting others, and relationships, we know that. So it's difficult, but continuing to work towards that is very important. So trauma screening assessment, these are important parts of the healing pathway. You're very familiar with these, but briefly, screening is that brief focused inquiry to determine an individual's experience of the traumatic events or current events and how they're being impacted by it. Are they having intrusive thoughts, feelings, or behaviors associated with trauma? There's a long list of symptoms that they could experience. How are they being impacted? And the assessment is the more in-depth exploration of the nature and severity of the traumatic events and the consequences. Screening, as Fallot and Harris tell us, is sensitively explores prior and current trauma-related experiences, takes place within a safe setting, again, safe setting. So when we're asking questions, it's not just a validated tool and asking people to check the boxes. Who's ever asking the questions, often it's the clinician, but if not, it's someone who is trained in how to sensitively administer that assessment. We use shared decision-making skills, understanding that a client may not be willing to answer the questions at that time, and that's perfectly fine. Do we have a way that we can round back? A month later, 2 months later, round back and try again to ask the questions related to what's happened to an individual and how they're impacted. This can help us, with our accurate diagnosis of anything that may be associated with trauma. It helps us gather new information, and again, it's about shared decision making. This is an example just of how assessing for trauma can be so very important. When it comes to ADHD and using that diagnosis for children, we know that trauma leads to symptoms that resemble ADHD. And we know that through research that children have been misdiagnosed with ADHD when it is not ADHD, it is in fact a trauma response or exposure to trauma. So it is incredibly important to make sure that when we're suspecting ADHD, to be very curious, to explore, why a child is turning out having trouble concentrating, being moody and hyperactive, and making sure we don't misdiagnose, because as you know, when we misdiagnose, then the treatment is also not aligned, and an individual isn't going to get better. Yes, screening is important for collaborative relationships, making sure we're not re-traumatizing, building strengths. So now just going into some of the trauma-specific treatments, here's a list of physical somatic approaches that again embrace the mind-body connection, really embrace the neurobiology around the brain science, about how we can quiet those neural pathways that are oversensitized. Understanding that mind-body connection and helping, really everyone needs this. So helping people figure out how to bring it into their own lives, or referring them to yoga, referring them to any practices that make sense. And it's a lot of practices that, as I said, gardening, any way people can connect in the community. Rhythmic repetitive interventions are very helpful for healing the lower brain, but remembering the mind-body connection. Other trauma-specific treatments, cognitive behavioral approaches, trauma-focused CBT, prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive therapy for PTSD. Skills training, those treatments that focus on skills, seeking safety, etc. DBT, want to talk a little bit more about both of those. And then EMDR here on the bottom of this list. Here are some other therapies, and I'm guessing that you could add to these. These therapies are coming online. There's more and more evidence-based practices that have been tested and researched that are becoming available. And then, of course, therapies and interventions that peer support specialists can do, including seeking safety and RAP. So I want to just talk about these very quickly. The Wellness Recovery Action Plan is from Mary Ellen Copeland Center, and this is a wonderful, wonderful trauma-informed interaction that our peer specialists do, and it really focuses on strengths and resources to develop an action plan that we can use in specific situations. So wellness daily maintenance. It really helps us focus on what might activate us and what our action plan will be. Who are we going to call? What do we need? Where should we be, etc. The interesting thing about a RAP plan is doing that when someone is well or feeling better is most beneficial. And unfortunately though, when someone gets well, we kind of back off and go to the individual who's more in crisis mode. So making sure we do a RAP plan when someone is feeling better is a really helpful intervention, because it's then available when they're not. Seeking Safety by Lisa Najovitz, a present focus safety to help people attain therapy to help people attain safety from trauma, PTSD, and substance abuse. A very accessible intervention. All levels of training can use this. It really is focused on that first stage of treatment, which is safety. There's 25 modules, and you can just buy this book and use one module or use all 25, use them out of order. Very helpful. These are some of the principles of Seeking Safety. And then EMDR. I'm sure you're familiar with EMDR, this comprehensive integrative psychotherapy approach that has been proven to be evidence-based and really helped people diminish their symptoms. Again, this is very specifically trained clinician who would use EMDR. And then DBT helps people change maladaptive behaviors such as self-harm, suicidal thinking, and substance abuse. And was first used with individuals experiencing borderline personality disorder. We know this is helpful for everybody. Learning about the triggers that lead to reactive states and how we can assess our coping skills and use those. I'm going to finish up here with this slide. As clinicians, please remember there are no double standards. So everything that you teach your clients and the people that you partner with, you need to do yourself. Find peer support and connection for yourself. Seek supervision and consultation. Find as much training as you can. Do your own individual clinical work. Maintain your own balance and set clear boundaries. So there's no that this is just for other people. This is for all of us. And in order to do this work well in a trauma-informed way, you're going to need to take care of yourself. There's the quick guide for clinicians. Here's another resource, Adult Surviving Child Abuse Practice Guidelines. And I just leave you with this. Remember, even in the face of storms, you are doing the best you can, and it is enough. And thank you for the work you do. Thank you, really. You are making such a difference every day.